So over the past few days, there's been increasing calls for Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon. There was a UN Security Council meeting, an emergency UN Security Council meeting about this issue. France called the meeting, and speaker after speaker, the representatives from France, from the UK, from China, from Russia, and more, Pakistan, they all were calling for Israel to withdraw, and they were all citing the same document. If you've been following the news about Lebanon, you might have heard talk of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Right, that is a 2006 resolution that ended the Second Lebanon War. And in it, one of the provisions in it is that Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon. And I want to look at that resolution with you. We're going to look at a few details in it. We're not going to read the entire thing. It's too long. But when you actually read what it says, and I read the whole thing today, you're going to see that there's stuff in there that the diplomats at the UN are not bringing up and don't want to talk about, and the media certainly is not talking about. But let's start. Let's set the stage here by talking about what's actually happening right now. So you see this headline on your screen here. This is from Turkish state media. UN Security Council members urge Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon. What does it say here? Several UN Security Council members urged Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon during an emergency meeting on Monday as concerns mounted that Israel's expanding military occupation in Lebanon and threats to strike its capital Beirut could derail efforts to secure a broader regional ceasefire. The session was convened at France's request after Israeli forces advanced further into southern Lebanon, occupied the strategic Beaufort Castle, and raised an Israeli flag over the site, reviving memories of Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon between 1982 and 2000. Lebanon has emerged as a major point of contention in the ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations, blah, 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 etc. Let's get to what we want here. Lebanon's ambassador, Ahmad Arafa, urged the council to condemn Israel's actions, accusing Tel Aviv of capitalizing, as usual, on a tense regional climate. He said Israel was continuing a systematic campaign of destruction, deliberately targeting medical personnel, hospitals, journalists, schools, security agencies, UN peacekeepers, places of worship, and archaeological sites, those horrible Israelis. This is the Lebanese UN rep, as well as countless other targets. The situation in Lebanon is deeply alarming, Martha Ama-Akia Pobi, UN Assistant Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations, told the council. These positions at the UN are something, right? Pobi said Israel's presence north of the Blue Line, I'll show that to you in a moment on a map. That's really just the Lebanese-Israeli border. She said that Israel's presence north of the Blue Line violated Lebanon's sovereignty and Security Council Resolution 1701. Israeli forces must withdraw to south of the Blue Line, she said, while also stressing that Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups in Lebanon must disarm. Russia's envoy accused Israel of replicating tactics used in Gaza. And he said that Israel's offensive in Lebanon was an identical replay of the Gaza war, that the continued occupation in South Lebanon could fuel support for armed resistance, deepen sectarian tensions, and risk triggering a civil war. He said it was unjustified aggression. China also expressed concern over Israel's expanding ground operations. Military force is not the solution. France's UN envoy said Hezbollah bore responsibility for triggering the hostilities, but warned that Israel's military response was counterproductive. Nothing can justify the continued scale of its military operations. Britain's ambassador said Hezbollah had dragged Lebanon to the war, but that Israel's actions were worsening the conditions for civilians. Now, the U.S. placed the onus for de-escalation on Hezbollah and Iran, avoiding criticism of Israel's military attacks. Acting U.S. Representative Michael Waltz said that peace could be achieved quickly if Hezbollah stopped the attacks on Israel and honored its commitments to halt hostilities. Okay, that's that piece. That's Turkish state media there. So let's just sum up the key points here. France called this Emergency Security Council meeting And here, from Turkish state media, not exactly a friend of Israel, you can see who showed up to demand Israeli withdrawal: France, Britain, China, Russia. And they're all citing resolution. And if you go back and watch the speeches, I actually watched the hearing. They're all citing 1701. Now, notice something buried at the bottom of the article. The UN official at the meeting said, yeah, Hezbollah also has to disarm. One sentence. But most of the meeting was just, they didn't even mention Hezbollah. Most of these guys didn't mention Hezbollah at all. They just talked about the need for Israel to withdraw. We'll come back to that. Now, let's take a look at another interesting media source, and that is Global Times. This is Chinese state-run media. Chinese envoy calls for immediate ceasefire, Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon at UN Security Council meeting. And here also, he's going to cite 1701, and the guy's name is Fu Kong. He's the Chinese permanent rep to the UN. Look what it says here. All parties concerned, especially Israel, must immediately cease hostilities, fully abide by the temporary ceasefire arrangements, implement UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and other relevant resolutions, and work to de-escalate as soon as possible. Okay, there you go. They want full implementation of 1701. Okay, we're going to find out what's in it soon. So this is Fu Kong saying that that we have to implement 1701. And for 20 years, the Chinese rep, the permanent, who has a permanent seat on the Security Council, never brought up anything else that's in 1701 besides Israeli withdrawal. And we'll get into that in a moment. But first, let me show you what we're actually talking about geographically. Okay, let's just understand a few things. We'll do this very quickly. Let's take a look at a map. So here's a map of South Lebanon. Here's the border between Israel and Lebanon. This blue line here. This is the border. Okay. And this here, this blue line, is the Litani River that you've heard so much about. And you notice that the Litani River gets actually really close to Israel at one point, really right here by Kfar Kila and Metula. And according to UN Security Council 1701, this area here, which is about 20 miles, 30 kilometers at, approximately, you see it's not exactly the same everywhere, but this zone here is supposed to be completely demilitarized other than the Lebanese armed forces themselves. Okay, that's the situation. Okay, now, and that's, again, 1701 designates between the Litani and the Israeli border as a weapons-free zone. Right? No military presence other than the Lebanese army and UN peacekeepers. Now, keep this geography in mind as we read further. So now we're going to look at UN Security Council Resolution 1701, the famous 1701 that everyone's talking about from 2006. Okay, so here we have it. It's a 4-page document. Like I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to show you 3 passages because they tell the whole story that we're talking about here. So let's first look at the preamble. Recalling all previous resolutions, and it gives a list of all the previous resolutions. And here we go. Here's where it really gets started. Expressing the Security Council, expressing, meaning that's the opening, and every single paragraph begins with something the Security Council is doing. It's recalling, and now it is expressing its utmost concern at the continuing escalation of hostilities in Lebanon and in Israel since Hezbollah's attack on Israel on July 12, 2006, which has already caused hundreds of deaths and injuries on both sides, extensive damage to infrastructure, and and hundreds of thousands of displaced persons. The reason I highlighted that is that right there in the opening paragraph, the Security Council, the same body that met on Monday to pressure Israel to withdraw, acknowledges that Hezbollah started it, right? Since Hezbollah attacked Israel on July 12th in 2006. And it's the same pattern. It's 20 years later, and it's the same thing. How did this all start right now, what we're dealing with in Lebanon? There was not a shot being fired between Israel and Lebanon for months and months and months until March 2nd, right? 2 days after the US and Israel started attacking Iran in this current conflict, Hezbollah started firing rockets at Israel, started firing drones at Israel, right? So it's the same story over and over again. Israel does not start these things. Like, ever. Okay. Now let's go to paragraph 8. I think there's 19 paragraphs in this whole thing. Let's jump down to 8. Look at paragraph 8. The Security Council calls for Israel and Lebanon to support a permanent ceasefire and a long-term solution based on the following principles and elements. This is what it actually calls for. Right? Like a lot of the statements in this are just reiterating things or affirming things. And then there's these sections where it calls for specific demands, right? It makes demands. So it calls for Israel and Lebanon to support this permanent ceasefire based on the following principles and elements. Number 1, full respect for the blue line by both parties. In other words, that you have a sovereign border that both sides respect. Then, security arrangements to prevent the resumption of hostilities, including the establishment between the blue line and the Litani River of an area free of any armed personnel, assets, and weapons other than those of the government of Lebanon and of UNIFIL, that's the UN force, as authorized in paragraph 11, deployed in this area. Okay, sounds good to me. So I want to point out, we just introduced something new. Okay? Or right here. Full implementation of the relevant provisions of the Taif Accords and of resolutions 1559 and 1680 that require the disarmament of all armed groups in Lebanon. So there were these two other resolutions, 1559 in 2004, 1680 earlier in 2006, before this one, that required the disarmament of all armed groups in Lebanon. So that pursuant to the Lebanese cabinet decision of July 27, 2006, there will be no weapons or authority in Lebanon other than that of the Lebanese state. This is a new term that was introduced, the Taif Accords. We'll talk about those in a moment. It also says no foreign forces in Lebanon without the consent of the government, no sales or supply of arms and related material to Lebanon except as authorized by the government, and provision to the United Nations of all remaining maps of landmines in Lebanon in Israel's possession. So these are the terms that are supposed to be implemented by 1701. I hope that was clear. Now, the same resolution that China just cited, and all the others just cited, calls for disarmament of all armed groups so that there will be no weapons other than those of the Lebanese state and UNIFIL. This has never been implemented. Never, not for a day. Not briefly and then violated. Never. Not in 2006, not in 2016, not in 2025, when the Lebanese government promised to disarm Hezbollah. Never. And there was not one emergency Security Council session over the 20 years since this was signed that ever was called to discuss the problem that 1701 is not being implemented at all. Meaning this 1701 was never implemented by the other side, by Lebanon. Now let's read this next citation very carefully. Okay, this is paragraph 3. And I'll tell you, I read a lot of these international documents, like these diplomacy declarations and whatever, and these Security Council resolutions, and they often have contradictions built into them. And here's one that's interesting. This is paragraph 3. The UN Security Council emphasizes the importance of the extension of the control of the government of Lebanon over all Lebanese territory, right? The importance of Lebanon actually governing its own territory in accordance with the provisions of Resolution 1559 and 1680. That's those other two resolutions that call for the disarming of all other militias. And of the relevant provisions of the Taif Accords. There it is again. I'll explain it in a moment. And of the relevant provisions of the Taif Accords for it to exercise, it meaning Lebanon, to exercise its full sovereignty so that there will be no weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon. There will be no weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon, and no authority other than that of the government of Lebanon. Oh, interesting. No weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon. In other words, there could be weapons with the consent of the Lebanese government. That would be permitted, authorized, legitimate under this resolution. Hold that thought, because we're going to need it. You see, we now have to understand the Taif agreement. So Hezbollah has weapons, lots of them. Let's go back to 1989. 1989 is when the Lebanese civil war that had raged for about 15 years came to an end. And it came to an end by the signing of the Taif Accords. It's the agreement that ended the Lebanese civil war. It's got nothing to do with Israel. Israel's not mentioned in the thing. And in this document, and it did a few things. The Taif agreement is very complex. It included a restructuring of some of the governmental powers that were in the hands of the prime minister and the president and the speaker of the House and the parliament. It changed some things and reordered it, and it became constitutional in Lebanon, the Taif Accords. But it's the agreement that ended the Lebanese civil war. And one of the passages in the Taif Accords requires all militias in Lebanon to disarm, because there was a lot of terrorist groups operating in Lebanon from the early 1970s until 1990. There was all these different Palestinian groups and Syrian groups, and of course Hezbollah that came along in the middle of that. It required all of these militias to disarm, Christian militias, Palestinian factions, everyone except Hezbollah. What? Excuse me? You might be thinking. That's correct. There was a carve-out in the Taif Accords. There was a carve-out allowing Hezbollah to still have its weapons. Look it up. You could look up Taif agreement on Wikipedia and you'll see this there. It's true. They basically said all the militias have to disarm, but Hezbollah doesn't. And they designated that the reason stated for why Hezbollah did not need to disarm was that Hezbollah is a resistance force against Israel. Understand what this means. The Lebanese, in the closing of the Lebanese civil war, and they're creating the new Lebanese government, and they're deciding what to do with all the militias, they said there's going to be an exception that Hezbollah is going to be allowed to keep its weapons because they're doing the holy work of fighting Israel. So Hezbollah, all these years, building up weapons, has not been acting outside of Lebanese law. This was Lebanon's government making a sovereign decision to authorize Hezbollah's armed status, specifically for the purpose of fighting Israel. Now let's go back to that line in 1701 that I just read to you, that there can be no weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon. Lebanon consented to Hezbollah's weapons officially, sovereignly, which means by the plain language of the very resolution being cited against Israel, Hezbollah's weapons are not a violation of 1701, right? Look what it says there in clause 3. The importance of the extension of control and application of the relevant provisions of the Taif Accords so that there will be no weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon. Very slippery language, but basically allowing the carve-out of the Taif Accords for Hezbollah to remain. Let me show you this, which will kind of emphasize the point. This is an article from last year, not so long ago, from October of 2025. And it quotes Hezbollah's leader, Naim Qassem, as saying that possessing weapons is a legitimate right of Hezbollah. Possession of weapons is an inseparable part of our legitimate right. Resistance is a legitimate right, Naim Qassem said in an interview. The Lebanese state decides how it wants to act internally regarding the handling of weapons. Israel has nothing to do with it. Now, with everything that I've told you, this statement actually has much more meaning. He's saying this is an internal Lebanese matter, and we have every right to our weapons because they're for resistance. Naim Qassem, the current leader of Hezbollah, saying this, I know this is going to surprise you, but he's not wrong, because under Lebanese sovereign policy, going back to the Taif Accords, the Lebanese government authorized Hezbollah to have weapons. So Qasem isn't making a false claim. He's actually citing the Taif Agreement, a formal decision of Lebanon's government. So here's the trap that the international community has walked into. If Hezbollah's weapons are legitimate, as Lebanon decided, then when Hezbollah fired rockets at Israel on March 2nd, unprovoked, those weren't the actions of a rogue militia operating outside of Lebanese authority. Those were Lebanon's state-sanctioned resistance force using its state-sanctioned, state-authorized weapons to attack Israel. So Lebanon owns that attack. Part of the narrative is that, it's Hezbollah, this rogue terrorist group, they're attacking Israel, and the Lebanese government, they're an innocent party here. You can't have it both ways. Either Hezbollah is an independent actor outside of Lebanese sovereignty, in which case their weapons violate Lebanese law and Lebanon should have disarmed them, or Hezbollah is Lebanon's sanctioned resistance force against Israel, in which case Lebanon owns everything Hezbollah does. And the international community has spent forever, basically 35 years or whatever, pretending that this isn't the case. Now, some people will say, but Lebanon can't control Hezbollah. They're a victim of Hezbollah. Okay, maybe that's true. Let's take that seriously. But it doesn't matter. It's immaterial because either way, Israel's justified. Let me explain. Either Lebanon has the ability or had the ability at some point over these years to disarm Hezbollah and chose not to, in which case Lebanon made a hostile policy choice for 35 years, and in which case Israel is entitled to respond. Meaning if they had the ability and they didn't do it, then Israel is totally entitled to respond and they bear responsibility. On the other hand, maybe Lebanon didn't have the ability to disarm Hezbollah, which is probably true. So if they didn't have the ability to disarm them, in which case that means that Lebanon can't control its own territory, it can't prevent attacks on Israel, and Israel has every right to do what Lebanon can't or won't do. You can't claim the protections of sovereignty, don't cross our borders, don't strike our territory, but you refuse the responsibilities of sovereignty, right? Which is controlling what's launched from your territory to your neighbor. Right? If you have sovereignty that it only protects the attacker and never restrains them, that's not sovereignty, it's just cover. Just cover for attacks. Okay, let me use an analogy to express this whole thing. I think this is a really valuable analogy. Imagine the following. Imagine that the Mexican government actually made a decision as a government, as a legislature. They voted on it. They made a decision that the cartels are exempt from any demand that they disarm. Meaning that we're fine with the cartels having weapons. And that they said that not only did they say that we now are fine with the cartels controlling a whole part of Mexico and having their weapons, not only are we okay with it, but the reason that we're okay with it is because we like the fact that they are attacking the United States, that their stated purpose of the cartel's weapons is to attack the United States, and therefore, and we hate the United States, and therefore we are going to sanction and give approval and allow, make an exemption to the rule that people shouldn't have big weapons. We're going to say that, no, the cartels can have their weapons because they're attacking the U.S. And then the cartels launch a cross-border attack into Texas. Would anyone argue that the U.S. has no right to respond to the cartels attacking Texas? And would anyone argue that Mexico has no responsibility under those circumstances? Would the argument of you're hurting innocent Mexicans, imagine if that charge was then levied at the United States. Mexico is innocent, you're hurting Mexico. Would that carry the same weight if we knew that the Mexican government had actually voted to keep the cartels armed because, like, specifically to attack Americans? Of course not. It's ridiculous. And if the cartel leader stood up and said, what do you mean? Possessing weapons is our legitimate right, he'd be telling the truth under his own government's law, because that truth implicates his government. It doesn't protect his government. And that's the situation with Lebanon and Hezbollah exactly. Okay, here, look at this Jerusalem Post story. Look how absurd this is. This is from, when is this? Like yesterday or 2 days ago? UN Secretary General Guterres proposes new force to replace Lebanon's UNIFIL. My gosh. Okay, Israeli forces are finally doing what 1701 required 20 years ago. And the UN Secretary General Guterres wants to replace UNIFIL with a new UN force, a rebranded version of the same mission that failed. Right? Here's what was discovered when Israel went into southern Lebanon. Okay, Hezbollah weapons depots, missile stockpiles, tunnel networks, and you know what? A lot of that was built right near UN bases, right near UNIFIL bases. They knew about it. The UNIFIL bases, in many cases, could see the Hezbollah infrastructure being built. The world knew about this. No one acted. So that whole area between the Litani and Israel's northern border, that whole area became a Hezbollah militarized zone, even though UNIFIL was there. They did nothing. Here, there's a quote in here from Israel's UN ambassador, Dani Danon. It's a good quote. Let me pull it up here. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Dani Danon, told the Jerusalem Post, after years of complete failure to implement Resolution 1701, the UN is now proposing to replace one failed force with another under a different name. A clear decision was made to end UNIFIL's mandate at the end of the year, and there's no justification for attempting to circumvent it. Those who failed to prevent Hezbollah's rearmament for 2 decades will not achieve different results simply by wearing different uniforms and operating under a new title, under a new name. The whole thing is ridiculous. Okay, let's bring this whole thing together and end this video. 35 years ago, under the Taif Accords, Lebanon made a sovereign decision to keep Hezbollah armed, specifically to attack Israel. They were in favor of that. And then 20 years ago, the UN passed Resolution 1701 and promised the world that it would fix that. That the UNIFIL would prevent Hezbollah from getting entrenched between the Litani and the northern border, right? And the Lebanese army would be the only armed group in Lebanon. We're going to fix it. Neither Lebanon nor the UN did anything. And now the same UN Security Council that ignored those failures for 20 years is meeting in an emergency session to stop Israel from solving the problem they created. China invokes 1701 to demand Israeli withdrawal, the same 1701 that China never enforced for 20 years. France calls Israel's response disproportionate. France helped write 1701 and watched Lebanon violate it immediately and forever since. The UK says Hezbollah dragged Lebanon into a war its people didn't want, while acknowledging that the Lebanese government never disarmed Hezbollah as they were required to do. And they're all citing the same document, right? They're trying to enforce half of it, the half that restrains Israel. But the half that would have restrained Hezbollah, no, we don't care about that. 20 years, never brought it up. Okay, this is ridiculous. Israel's doing what the UN promised to do in 2006, but never did. And the same people who failed to keep that promise are now meeting in an emergency session to stop Israel from keeping it. Now, one more thing. The next time someone tells you that Israel needs to comply with Resolution 1701, just ask them which part of 1701, because there are 2 parts, and the world has only ever demanded compliance with one of them. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you found it interesting. Please drop a comment below. Let me know what you thought. And if you found it valuable, please share it with someone else. Please tell someone else about it, because people are talking about this whole Lebanon thing and they don't know what they're talking about. And we need to just speak truth and be very straightforward about what's actually happening. Thank you. God bless.